Welcome to Midnight Grove, where the quiet hours of the night bring stories to life. Tonight's tale, The Town That Only Exists at Night, follows Elias, a man who takes a wrong turn on his way home and stumbles into a town that shouldn't exist. A town where the clocks run backward, the streets hum with forgotten memories, and a book on a shelf already knows his story. But Lorien is more than just a place. It is a cycle, a story unfinished. And Elias has been here before, many times before. Tonight he must decide, will he break the loop, or will he be lost in this town forever? So settle in, close your eyes, and let the story unfold. Chapter 1, The Wrong Turn. Elias had always been a man of reason. He believed in maps, schedules, and well-lit streets. He did not believe in lost places. And yet here he was, standing on a cobblestone street that shouldn't exist, under lamplights that flickered like distant stars, in a town that was not on any map, a street that shouldn't be there. It had started with a wrong turn. Elias had been walking home from his usual late-night shift at the university library. The path was familiar. Left at the cafe, right at the bridge, straight past the old clock tower. But tonight, the clock tower wasn't there. Instead, the street stretched further than it should have, winding into a place he didn't recognize. Buildings lined the path, warm light glowing from their windows. Shops with old-fashioned lettering on their signs. A florist, a tailor, a cafe, but nothing modern. It looked like a street from another time. Elias frowned. Had he been walking longer than he thought? He checked his watch. 12:07 a.m. Still late, but not enough to explain this. Not enough to explain why the air smelled of rain that hadn't fallen. Why the streetlights flickered as if they were remembering how to glow. Why somewhere in the distance he could hear a soft hum, like a clock ticking in reverse. And then a voice. "You're early tonight." The cafe that knew his name. Elias turned sharply. A small cafe stood to his right, its windows fogged with warmth, golden light spilling onto the street. The door was propped open, and in the doorway, a man stood smiling at him. He was in his 50s, perhaps older, dressed in a crisp white shirt and a dark apron. His salt and pepper hair was combed back neatly, but there was something familiar in the way he leaned against the door frame, as if he had been expecting Elias. Elias hesitated. Sorry, I think I'm lost." The man's smile didn't falter. "You always say that," he said. "Come in, Elias." Elias froze. A chill crept up his spine. "How do you know my name?" The man tilted his head. "Because you come here every night." Elias took a step back. "That's not possible." The man simply shrugged. "Maybe you just don't remember." The clock that ran backward. Elias hesitated. The street was empty. The only sound was the soft clinking of cups inside the cafe. He didn't want to go inside, but something pulled at him, like a half-forgotten dream trying to surface. Slowly he stepped into the cafe. The scent of coffee and vanilla wrapped around him like a memory. The cafe was small, cozy, with shelves of books lining the walls. At the far end of the room, a large clock ticked gently above the counter. Elias frowned. The second hand was moving backward. A faint sense of unease settled in his chest. He turned back to the man. "Where am I?" The man studied him for a long moment. Then, in a voice too calm for the question at hand, he said, "You're in the town of Lorien." Elias had never heard of it, but when the name hit the air, his head ached, as if something inside him recognized it. The town that exists at night. The man poured a cup of coffee and set it on the counter. "You should sit," he said. "You always need a moment to adjust." Elias ignored the chair. "Adjust to what?" The man met his eyes. "To remembering." Elias's pulse quickened. "I don't understand." The man smiled faintly. "You've been coming here for years." Elias's breath caught. "That's not possible. I've never been here before." The man simply raised an eyebrow, and then, motioning toward the bookshelves, he said, "Then why is your name written inside one of those?" Elias turned, and there on the nearest shelf, a book with his name on the spine. A book that shouldn't exist. Elias stepped forward slowly, pulse racing. The book was old, its deep blue cover worn at the edges. He reached out, fingertips brushing the spine. The moment he touched it, a memory surfaced. A street just like this one. Golden lights, the smell of coffee. A night long ago. No, not just a night. This night, over and over again. Elias's breath hitched. "What is this place?" he whispered. The man behind the counter, the cafe owner who knew him, who had been expecting him, sighed. "It's the town that only exists at night." He leaned forward, his voice gentle. "And you, Elias?" His gaze was knowing. "You've been coming here for longer than you remember." Chapter 2, The Book That Remembered Him. Elias stood frozen, his fingers barely touching the spine of the book. It was his name on the cover, Elias Mercer. The letters were faded with age, the gold embossing worn smooth, as if this book had been read many, many times before. But he had never seen it before in his life. Had he? A sharp ache pulsed at the back of his skull. Something inside him whispered, "You know this book, even if you don't remember why." A story that was already written. Slowly, carefully, Elias pulled the book from the shelf. It was heavier than he expected. The pages were thick, old-fashioned parchment, their edges uneven. He turned to the first page, and his breath caught. It wasn't blank. It wasn't an unwritten book waiting for a story. It was already filled with his life, the chapters of his past. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. There were dates, moments, memories, things only he should have known. His childhood home, the street where he'd learned to ride a bike, the time he broke his wrist falling from a tree. Further in, the pages detailed his years at university. And then his job at the library, the daily walks home, the way he always checked the time, always followed the same route. Everything about his life was written here. Every detail, up until last night. Then the pages stopped. Elias turned to the end of the book, but the remaining pages were blank. As if his story wasn't finished yet. How is this possible? Elias's heart pounded. He turned sharply to the cafe owner, who was watching him with quiet patience. "What is this?" Elias demanded. "How does this book know my life?" The man didn't look surprised. "You always ask that," he said. Elias's pulse quickened. That phrase, "you always ask that," the words sent a chill down his spine. "How many times have I been here?" he asked. The cafe owner's gaze softened. "More than you realize." Elias's throat tightened. He turned the page again, desperate for something, anything that would make sense. And then, at the bottom of the last written page, he saw it. A single sentence. One that hadn't been there a moment ago. The ink still wet. "It's time to remember, Elias. A door that shouldn't exist." Elias slammed the book shut. "I don't understand what's happening," he said. The cafe owner gestured toward the back of the shop. "You should see for yourself." Elias hesitated. But the air had changed. The warm scent of coffee was fading, replaced by something older, something heavier. He turned slowly. And there, where there had been only a solid brick wall before, a door had appeared. A tall wooden door, its surface carved with symbols that looked just familiar enough to unsettle him. Elias took a step toward it, pulse pounding in his ears. "What's behind there?" he asked. The cafe owner studied him. "Your next chapter." Elias swallowed. "And if I open it?" The man's eyes darkened, but his voice remained calm. "Then you will finally understand why you keep coming back to Lorien." Elias exhaled slowly. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he reached for the handle. And he pulled the door open. The room of forgotten nights. A wave of cold air swept over him. The room beyond the door was not part of the cafe. It was something else. A library, dimly lit. The scent of aged paper and dust hung thick in the air. Bookshelves stretched endlessly into the darkness, each one lined with books that had no titles. And at the center of the room, a single wooden desk. A lamp flickered softly, casting long shadows. And in the chair behind the desk, bent over a stack of open pages, was Elias. Seeing himself, Elias staggered back. The man at the desk, him but not him, lifted his head, and their eyes met. Elias felt the floor tilt beneath him, his vision swimming. This wasn't possible. And yet, the other Elias simply studied him, his expression unreadable. And then, without a hint of surprise, he said, "You're late this time." A life that repeats. Elias's chest tightened. He took a slow step forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath him. What is this?" His own voice came back to him, softer, calmer. "This is where it starts and where it ends." The other Elias gestured to the desk in front of him. Scattered across it were pages covered in ink. Elias stepped closer, his pulse hammering, and as he read the first line, he felt the breath leave his lungs. Elias Mercer always walks home the same way, until one night he makes a wrong turn and finds himself in the town of Lorien. Elias's hands clenched. This is my story." The other Elias nodded. "You've written it before." Elias shook his head. "No, I don't write. I've never written this story." His reflection gave him a sad, knowing look. You always say that too. Elias's pulse pounded. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. And yet, the book, the town, the streets, the smell of coffee, everything felt too familiar, as if he had been here before, as if he had lived this night many times over. The truth waiting in chapter 3. The other Elias picked up a pen from the desk, tapped it against the paper. You have a choice, he said. He held out the pen. You can finish writing the story. Elias swallowed. And if I don't? The other Elias smiled faintly. Then we start over. The word sent a cold shiver down Elias's spine. This wasn't just a town. It was a loop. A story unfinished. A story waiting for him to end it. Elias stared at the pen, heart pounding. And then, before he could decide, the candlelight flickered. The room tilted, and the world around him began to dissolve. To be continued. Chapter 3, the end of the story. The world around Elias fractured. The walls of the endless library trembled. The bookshelves flickered in and out of existence, their edges unraveling like ink dissolving in water. The candlelight dimmed, and standing at the desk, still watching him with calm, knowing eyes, was himself, the other Elias, the one who had been waiting, the one who had written this story before. And he was still holding out the pen, still waiting for Elias to choose. The choice he always makes. Elias's heart pounded. He stepped forward, closer to the desk, closer to the pen that shouldn't exist. He didn't want to take it. And yet, something inside him knew he always does. He had been here before. And every time he made a choice, one that had brought him back to this moment, to this town, to this desk. The other Elias studied him, head tilted slightly as if reading his thoughts. You know what happens next, he said. Elias's breath caught. I don't. The other Elias smiled faintly. You do. And then he gestured to the final page of the book, and Elias saw that the story was waiting for its last line. The story that always repeats. The final page was nearly complete. It had recorded every step of his journey tonight. The walk home, the wrong turn, the first time he saw the glowing lamplights of Lorien, the café, the book with his name on it, the door that should not have existed. And now, this moment, a story that had played out over and over again, but never ended. Not yet. And at the bottom of the page, in blank space where the last word should be, the ink was faintly shifting, like it was waiting for him to finish it. Elias's chest tightened. This is a cycle. The other Elias nodded. Yes. A loop. Yes. Elias swallowed hard. And every time I forget. The other Elias's expression softened. Because you choose to. The memory he was running from. The air around them shifted. And suddenly, Elias wasn't in the library anymore. He was somewhere else. A place he hadn't seen in years. A hospital room. The air smelled of sterile linens and rain against the window. A bed in the center of the room. And in it, a man. Thin, pale, eyes closed. his breathing slow and weak. Elias staggered back, because he knew this room. He knew the man lying there. His father. The night everything stopped. Elias felt his chest tighten, his breath suddenly hard to draw, because this was the last time he had seen him. This was the night he had sat by the hospital bed, holding a book he had never finished reading aloud. The last book his father had asked him to bring, a book Elias had promised they would finish together. But they never did, because that night his father had passed away, and Elias had left the book on the bedside table. Unfinished, the truth behind the loop. Elias's breath came sharp and uneven. He turned to the other Elias standing beside him, watching with quiet understanding. "Lorien," Elias whispered, "this town, this cycle, it's because of this." The other Elias nodded. "I keep coming back because you left something undone." Elias swallowed hard. "The book." His reflection tilted his head. "Not just the book, Elias, the ending." Then suddenly Elias understood. This wasn't just about a story in a book. This was about grief, about not being able to finish something because it meant admitting it was over. He had left that book unfinished because he couldn't bear to close it. And so he had trapped himself in a town of unfinished stories, a place where the nights repeated, where the clocks never moved forward, where time let him relive this journey over and over, but never reach the end, because he had refused to write it, to accept it, to move forward, breaking the cycle. Elias's hands shook. He turned back to the library, the desk, the final page of his book, the space waiting for the last line. The pen was still in the other Elias's hand, still waiting. Elias exhaled, and slowly, for the first time in years, he reached for it. His fingers curled around the pen. The other Elias smiled softly. And then he vanished, fading like a story finally reaching its last word, the last line. Elias turned to the book. His story. The one he had been rewriting for years. And for the first time he knew how it ended. He pressed the tip of the pen to the paper, and he wrote, and this time Elias did not forget. The moment the words hit the page, the ink glowed, the book shuddered, and then the town began to disappear. Lorien fades. The café dissolved first, its golden lights fading into the night. The cobblestone streets blurred into mist. The clock tower melted into the sky, and then the library crumbled into stars. The shelves, the desk, the pages, all of it vanishing like ink washed away by rain. And Elias let it go. He let the town fade. He let the cycle end. He let himself remember. Morning at last. When Elias opened his eyes, he was standing on the bridge near his apartment. The early morning light painted the horizon in soft blues and golds. The air smelled of rain. He checked his watch. 6:42 a.m. He had made it through the night, for the first time in years, and in his hand, the book was gone. But he didn't need it anymore, because he knew the ending now. He took a slow breath, and as he walked forward, toward a life that was finally his again, he thought, This time he would not forget. The town that only exists at night. Somewhere far away, a cafe door creaked open. A book returned to its shelf, and a street lamp flickered, waiting. Because some places do not disappear. They simply wait for the lost to return. And on certain nights, when the air hums with quiet longing, if you take the wrong turn, you might find yourself in Lorien. One last time. Thank you for joining us at Midnight Grove for the town that only exists at night. Some places do not vanish. They simply wait patiently for us to return. Elias's story is a reminder that sometimes the things we run from will find us again and again until we face them. As you drift into sleep, may you find peace in the endings you have yet to write, in the memories waiting to be remembered, and in the quiet magic of a night that never truly ends. Sleep well, and we'll see you next time for another story.